All right, guys. So yesterday, Donald Trump made an appearance at the National Association of Black Journalists event, and it pretty much popped off immediately from the beginning with the first question that was asked, where Trump was confronted on his, let's say, questionable history when it comes to overtly racist behavior. So let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this first question here and see how Trump handles it.
I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room, sir. A lot of people did not think it was appropriate for you to be here today. You have pushed false claims about some of your rivals, from Nikki Haley to former President Barack Obama, saying that they were not born in the United States, which is not true. You have told 4 congresswomen of color who were American citizens to go back to where they came from. You have used words like animal and rabbit to describe black district attorneys. You've attacked black journalists, calling them a loser, saying the questions that they ask are, quote, stupid and racist. You've had dinner with a white supremacist at your Mar-a-Lago resort. So my question, sir, now that you are asking black supporters to vote for you, why should black voters trust you after you have used language like that?
Well, first of all, I don't think I've ever been asked a question in such a horrible manner. First question. You don't even say, hello, how are you? Are you with ABC? Because I think they're a fake news network, a terrible network. And I think it's disgraceful that I came here in good spirit. I love the black population of this country. I've done so much for the black population of this country, including employment, including opportunity zones with Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, which is one of the greatest programs ever for black workers and black entrepreneurs. I've done so much, and and I say this, historically black colleges and universities were out of money, they were stone cold broke, and I saved them and I gave them long-term financing, and nobody else was doing it. I think it's a very rude introduction. I don't know exactly why you would do something like that. And let me go a step further. I was invited here, and I was told my opponent, whether it was Biden or Kamala, I was told my opponent was going to be here. It turned out my opponent isn't here. You invited me under false pretense. And then you said you can't do it with Zoom. Well, where's Zoom? She's going to do it with Zoom, and she's not coming. And then you were half an hour late. Just so we understand, I have too much respect for you to be late. They couldn't get their equipment working, or something was wrong.
Mr. President, I would love if you can answer the question on your rhetoric and why you believe that black voters should trust you with another 4 years.
I have been the best president for the black population since Abraham Lincoln. That's my answer.
Better than President Johnson, who signed the Voting Rights Act?
And for you to start off a question and answer period, especially when you're 35 minutes late because you couldn't get your equipment to work, in such a hostile manner, I think it's a disgrace.
Okay. So there's a lot going on there. First off, on the technical aspect of this, they were apparently like 30 plus minutes late. They couldn't sort out their audio. It got to the point where, Trump at some points couldn't even hear what the hosts were asking. And he had to ask them to ask the question a number of different times. There was also confusion as to whether or not Kamala Harris was going to show up to this event. Apparently she was invited. Now apparently she's going to be doing a similar thing in like September. So not exactly sure what the situation is with that. Now, in terms of Trump's response here, okay, you are running to be the most powerful man on the face of the planet. And you are showing up with your history, okay, and you're not expecting a tough question from the National Association of Black Journalists. You're not expecting a challenging question off the bat. What do you want them to ask you, right? How did you sleep last night? What have you eaten today? Like, what kind of question would you have preferred they start off with? The reason that she started off with that question is because, again, there was a lot of controversy surrounding whether or not they should even invite Donald Trump to this event in the first place, which I actually think they should, for probably the reason that we're witnessing right here, which is that Trump is going to kind of expose himself in a number of different ways, and that's informative to the public as he's running for president right now. And then he gets offended, basically. He gets offended at the first question and then says that he has done more for the black population than any president since Abraham Lincoln. Now, you heard the host there, or the journalist there, do a follow-up question that didn't really get answered, right? She made the comparison to Lyndon Johnson, right? And said, well, he signed the Civil Rights Act, right? So are you saying you've done more than him? Because what exactly? Because you created some jobs for black people. Trump also used the phrase black jobs during this appearance. It was just an absolute shit show from the beginning and throughout the entirety of this back and forth. Now, they actually left some stuff off of his racial history. She brought up the fact that he had dinner or lunch with a white supremacist at Mar-a-Lago. I believe she was referencing Nick Fuentes, who's not just a white supremacist, but he's a actual, I think, self-identified neo-Nazi. So that was something that happened. I think Milo Yiannopoulos was at that lunch or dinner as well. But if you guys want a more extensive history of Trump's racial past, here's an article from Vox, and some of the things that they didn't mention as a part of that setup question there was that in 1973, in the Nixon administration, the U.S. Department of Justice sued the Trump Management Corporation for violating the Fair Housing Act, right, for discrimination against potential black tenants that were going to stay at some of his properties. They also say that Kip Brown, a former employee at Trump's castle, accused another one of Trump's businesses of discrimination, saying, quote, when Donald and Ivana came to the casino, the bosses would order all the black people off the floor. In 1989, in a controversial case that's been characterized as a modern-day lynching, 4 black teenagers and 1 Latino teenager, the, quote, Central Park 5, were accused of attacking and raping a jogger in New York City, and Trump immediately took charge in the case, running an ad in local papers demanding, quote, bring back the death penalty. Bring back the death penalty. So, if anything, that question didn't even get to the real core of Trump's, decades-long racism that he has been putting on full display. Right. So I think it was an entirely reasonable question. I think it's something that he actually should have answered and shouldn't have danced around. But that's classic Trump right there. Right. We're getting some 2016 vibes once again. Now, on the same note, in terms of the weirdness, if you will, coming from Republicans, Trump and other ones, in terms of how they are handling this new election landscape with Kamala Harris replacing Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. Here we have Trump being asked about this narrative, this idea that Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate, right? So let's go ahead and listen to this.
She was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She has always identified as a black woman. She went to a historically black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't. Because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn, and she became a black person.
Just to be clear, sir, do you believe that she is...
I think somebody should look into that, too, when you continue in a very hostile, nasty tone.
It's a direct question, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is a DEI hire, as some Republicans
really don't
have
know.
said?
I mean, I really don't know. Could be. There are some, and there are plenty. I know this lady was always...
Okay, so let's handle this 2 different ways. Number one, on the is Kamala Harris a DEI hire, right? So my take on this is actually a little bit nuanced because we had Joe Biden back in 2020 when he was selecting who was going to be his VP pick. He basically openly said, I'm going to pick a black woman, right? And so if that's what you mean by DEI hire, that Biden said he was going to pick a black woman to be his vice president, and then he chose from a wide array of different potential options for that, and he happened to choose Kamala, if that's what you mean by DEI hire, fine. I don't really have an issue with that. But let's be honest about the reality of vice presidential picks, right? Usually it's the case that when a president is making, or presumptive president is making this kind of a decision on their VP, they are picking somebody who they think will give them some sort of an advantage in the upcoming election. For example, if you're going to call Kamala Harris a DEI hire, you would also have to call somebody like Mike Pence a DEI hire. Why? Because Mike Pence was chosen at the time, not because it was some sort of a meritocratic process and Mike Pence was the most qualified man for the job. It had nothing to do with that. It was because Trump thought that he needed to have a better appeal to evangelical voters. So he picked Mike Pence to be his running mate. Some people would make the same case about Obama picking Joe Biden to be his vice presidential candidate, right? He picked a standard, boring, corporate, foreign policy experienced in a bad way candidate like Joe Biden to be his VP, to sort of calm the nerves of semi-racist people who wouldn't have necessarily been fully comfortable with Obama being the president. Like, presidents pick VPs almost exclusively, I would say, along sort of like DEI lines, depending on what your definition of that is. Now, the reason I say it's a nuanced position is because, of course, that applies to basically every vice presidential pick, but that's not how Republicans are using the term DEI. And the perfect example that I have for this was back, if you guys remember, when the Baltimore bridge collapse happened. And you had the mayor of Baltimore, who is black, who came out and gave a statement about it after the fact. Now, that mayor had basically nothing to do with why the crash happened. That was more like corporate corruption and, cutbacks and shortcuts that I think led to that happening. He had basically nothing to do with it. But you had conservatives almost unanimously when he was coming out and giving that speech saying, this is what happens when you have a DEI mayor. And so the reality is that this term DEI for conservatives has basically just come to mean anytime a non-white person, specifically black people, have a job. That's what they mean now. The same thing with the Boeing situation, right? We're talking about decade and decade and decade of corporate corruption and monopolization and consolidation, and again, shortcuts that were taken to increase profit maximization. We're talking about systemic issues with capitalism, with Boeing as a company that led to some of the issues with their planes. And yet, what were conservatives talking about when all of this was happening with Boeing? They were talking about there are female pilots, and that's why this happened. Or it's because Boeing a few years ago instituted a DEI program. So Republicans use the phrase DEI in an explicitly racist way. Like, they are not using it in sort of a more nuanced way. They're just talking about when a black person has a job. So that's the first front of what I want to say about that. The second front, real quick, just to make this explicitly clear about Kamala Harris, who, again, I'm not really a fan of, but let's make this explicitly clear. Kamala Harris, they're trying to portray her as if she's been like flip-flopping on what her racial identity is. She identifies as Indian and then she identifies as black, depending on what's best for the situation. Kamala Harris is biracial. Like, conservatives are acting as if they have never heard of a biracial person existing before this. Kamala Harris has one parent, a father, who I believe is Jamaican and has African ancestry in his past, right? So that would make her have that sort of black or African-American, history in her lineage. She also has an Indian mother, right? I believe a South Indian mother specifically. She's biracial. She is Indian, and also she is black. So the idea that this is like complex or that it's difficult to figure out, or they're like attacking her and trying to get Kamala to pick one or the other is in and of itself racist, right? So that to me is completely insane and is only feeding in to the narrative against Republicans right now that y'all are just a bunch of fucking weirdos. Like, you're hyperfixating on Kamala Harris's race. Do you think that's going to play well politically? Didn't we already try this? Or you try this? Not we, you. Didn't you guys already try this? With Barack Obama, Donald Trump was one of the people who was leading the charge on the birtherism claims against Barack Obama, saying he wasn't born in America, right? He was born in Kenya, so he's an illegitimate president. Like, you guys have already, or should have already, learned the lesson that really leaning in to racist attacks against black candidates at the highest levels in American politics is not going to be a great strategy, right? Because we do have a lot of systemic racism in this country. We do have a lot of, racist people individually in this country. But at the end of the day, most Americans don't want to feel like they are racist. They do not want to think that they're racist, right? And so this is just going to be, I think, a total political L for Republicans going forward. But they can't help themselves. They really just can't help themselves. Now we move on to this, because in the same vein, this is the kind of shit they're showing at Trump rallies, guys. The Trump campaign is projecting this on the screen above the stage at a rally in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The headline here is California's Kamala Harris becomes first Indian American U.S. Senator. So again, they're trying to lean into this idea that because Bloomberg wrote an article saying that she's the first Indian American U.S. senator, that somehow removes her blackness, right? So she can't claim to be black because she also has an Indian mother. Like, what the fuck? What the fuck are we doing here, guys? It's just bizarre. It's just bizarre. Now we get to this clip. This is probably the most entertaining one out of any of these. This is Donald Trump being directly asked if JD Vance, as his vice presidential pick, who I think he regrets picking now, if he would be ready on day one. Let's listen to what Trump has to say about this.
And that's why this decision is important this time. Bad things happen. You said it twice. When you look at JD Vance, is he ready on day one?
Does he what?
Ready on day one, if he has to be.
I've always had great respect for him, and for the other candidates too. But I will say this, and I think this is well documented. Historically, the vice president, in terms of the election, does not have any impact. I mean, virtually no impact. You have 2 or 3 days where there's a lot of commotion as to who, like you're having it on the Democrat side, who it's going to be. And then that dies down, and it's all about the presidential pick. Virtually never has it mattered. Maybe Lyndon Johnson mattered for different reasons of what we're talking about, not for vote reasons, but for political reasons, other political reasons. But historically, the choice of a vice president makes no difference.
Okay. So I don't know if you could possibly get more of a direct verification that Trump absolutely regrets picking JD Vance. Now, reminder on the backstory of all of this, right? It looked like, according to the reporting that we have on what was going on behind the scenes, that Trump actually wanted to pick Doug Burgum or possibly even Glenn Youngkin. But his kids, Don and Eric, and as well as Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson, convinced him to pick JD Vance, right? So he ends up going with JD. And part of that pick was like, okay, they were really confident at the time. The polls were showing it was like a very, solidified win in their favor, assuming that Biden was going to continue being the nominee. Now you have this massive shakeup in the race with Kamala taking over, okay, and leading the top of the Democratic ticket. And now they're panicking because now this JD Vance pick looks absolutely awful. And I've shown you guys the polling data. He is historically unpopular, right? You can compare him to Sarah Palin, for example, who many people blame for costing John McCain the election against Obama. And he is infinitely worse than where Sarah Palin was at the same time. Sarah Palin, coming out of the gates when she was announced as John McCain's VP, was like plus 26 in approval rating. JD Vance, as of right now, is minus anywhere between 10 to 15 points in favorability. It's even worse if you go to the favorability numbers in his home state of Ohio, where he's a senator. Guys, this is an awful pick, and Trump clearly knows it. He's clearly fully aware that this was a disastrous pick. So he's asked a question, would JD Vance be ready on day one? And instead of just giving like a simple answer of like, yeah, of course he will. That's why I picked him. I think he's qualified and, he has experience and blah, blah, blah. Instead of doing that, he says, the vice presidential pick doesn't really matter, right? Who cares about VPs, right? You're voting for me. You're not voting for him. You're voting for me, right? Don't even think about JD Vance. Don't look up JD Vance couch or JD Vance woman dolphin or anything like that, right? Just focus on me. JD Vance doesn't really exist. He was kind of sort of an apparition from the beginning of all of this. Like, he hates JD Vance. I legitimately believe that he's pissed. He's pissed at his kids. He's pissed at Tucker. He's pissed at Elon for putting him in this position, right? And I think rightfully so, again, if you look at some of the polling data. Now, to finish off the video here, okay, we get to Kamala Harris. Because on the one hand, I do think there has been an insane amount of momentum for Kamala recently. I've said for a while now that there's every chance in the world that she may screw this up by picking a shitty VP and flip-flopping on positions and things like that, because I don't think she really believes in much. But we're already hitting that point now, right? The Kamala momentum is already kind of seemingly about to hit a brick wall here. So here from CNN, Harris recalibrates policy stances as she adjusts to roll atop the Democratic ticket. So some of the core ones that they point out here, she's no longer in favor of a ban on fracking. Many of these are policies that she temporarily supported back in 2020 during her failed presidential run. So she is no longer in favor of a ban on fracking, apparently. She's no longer in favor of single-payer healthcare, which is something we knew a long time ago. She backed off of this during the 2020 Democratic primary. I think that contributed to her downfall in that primary election, but she's no longer in favor of Medicare for all, in other words. right? So pretty shitty position to shift on there. Border control, she is basically right in line with where Joe Biden is right now, which is to say, like, you know, a lot of the Trump policies without a lot of the rhetorical overt racism against migrants, essentially. And then on police funding, of course, you know, she was the top cop in California. She was an AG. She was a DA. She was a prosecutor. I don't know that anyone would expect anything different from somebody like Kamala Harris, but she is vehemently against defunding the police. And at the same time as she is flip-flopping on all of her policy positions because she doesn't believe in anything, it looks like she is getting closer and closer towards picking who I think would be the worst of any of the VP potentials that have been floated. Josh Shapiro becomes an odds-on betting favorite to become Kamala Harris's vice president. Now, this could be reading a little bit too much into this, but apparently she's going to be making this announcement as soon as next week at a rally that she's going to be hosting in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. So either she's picking Josh Shapiro, or she's about to humiliate Josh Shapiro by announcing Tim Walz or Andy Beshear as her VP in Josh Shapiro's home state. So it's one of those two. I think the first one is probably more likely. So there you have it. We have Republicans not dodging the weird allegations and the racist allegations. I think we all could have seen this coming from a mile away. We saw a lot of this play out with Obama, but now it's sort of like a double whammy because not only is Kamala Harris not white, but she's also a female. So that's kind of like a massive, boiling pot for conservatives to stew in to try to come up with the weirdest, most racist, sexist attacks against her that they possibly can instead of focusing on, actual substantive attacks. And then at the same time, we have Kamala Harris still maintaining this momentum that she has right now, but potentially about to hit a brick wall because she's dodging some of the most popular positions she's held in the past, and looks like she's set to pick probably what I think is the worst VP option that she has on the table right now.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying